It was a misty morning in early October when Thomas O'Brien's old, rusted car rolled into the sleepy town of Dunmore, kicking up a cloud of dust as it traveled down the main street. The fog hung heavy in the air, wrapping the town in an eerie, almost surreal stillness. The road was quiet, save for the occasional sound of leaves skittering across the pavement. It was the kind of morning when the town seemed to be holding its breath. As Thomas passed the rows of quaint, weathered houses, his eyes scanned the landscape, taking in the small-town charm that seemed both unfamiliar and oddly welcoming. He had chosen Dunmore on a whim, having driven through the night with no particular destination in mind. His decision to stop here had been spontaneous, and something about the quiet beauty of the place had made him feel a strange sense of connection. But as he pulled into the only gas station at the edge of town, he felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him. This would be his home for the foreseeable future. The station attendant, a middle-aged man named Henry, barely looked up from his newspaper when Thomas approached. With a grin that seemed almost too wide for his face, Thomas introduced himself, his booming voice echoing across the empty street.
"I'm Thomas O'Brien,"
he said, shaking Henry's hand with enough force to make him wince.
"and I've come to shake things up around here."
Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled by the man's enthusiasm. He was used to the occasional traveler passing through, but something about Thomas's presence felt different. Larger, almost.
"You're not from around here,"
Henry said, trying to make small talk, his voice hesitant.
"Nope, not at all,"
Thomas said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket and faded jeans, and his boots made a deliberate thud as he walked.
"I've been all over, but Dunmore has a certain charm. I like it. I'm sticking around for a while."
The two exchanged a few more words, but Henry didn't have much to say. He was used to the quiet, predictable pace of life in Dunmore, and didn't particularly care to entertain newcomers. Thomas, however, was undeterred. As he filled his tank, he struck up a conversation with a few other local residents who had stopped by, drawing them in with his contagious laugh and wild stories. The way he told tales was captivating. He exaggerated every detail, making even the simplest events sound like epic adventures. He talked about a near-death experience with a bear in the Alaskan wilderness, how he once outran a speeding train while hitchhiking across the Midwest, and how he had once convinced a street magician in Paris to reveal all of his secrets. With each story, his hands moved with dramatic flair, his voice rising and falling in pitch as he spoke. By the time he finished, a crowd had gathered, captivated by the energy he exuded. It wasn't long before the local shopkeepers began to take notice. They peeked out from behind their store windows, curiously watching the scene unfold. A few men in overalls, who usually spent their afternoons sitting on the front porch of the local diner, stood up and walked over to hear more. Thomas didn't seem to mind that the crowd was growing. In fact, he seemed to thrive on it. His arrival had set something in motion in Dunmore, a ripple that would spread throughout the town. But it wasn't just his loud, over-the-top personality that drew people in. It was the aura of mystery that surrounded him. There was something about Thomas that felt like a riddle. Despite his openness, despite his booming voice and exuberant laughter, there was an undertone of sadness in his eyes. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but for those who were paying attention, it was impossible to ignore. As the day wore on, Thomas wandered through the town, his figure towering over the smaller buildings and streets. He stopped at the small antique bookstore on the corner, where the elderly owner, Mrs. Abernathy, welcomed him with a smile. She had been in Dunmore her entire life and had seen all sorts of people come and go, but there was something about Thomas that intrigued her. She had seen men like him before, ones who moved through life with a boldness that hid deeper scars. She watched him carefully, noting the way he lingered at the windows of the store, as if searching for something, perhaps a sign or an old memory he hadn't yet uncovered. Despite the underlying sadness, Thomas continued to put on his act for the townspeople. That night, he strolled into the local tavern, and the moment he stepped through the door, The entire room fell silent. The familiar clink of glasses stopped. The chatter died down. It was as if a gust of wind had blown through, carrying with it a strange energy.
Gentlemen, ladies!
Thomas called out, his voice resonating like a trumpet.
It's time to wake up this sleepy town.
His words were loud, but his presence was even louder. He took a seat at the bar, spinning a stool dramatically as though it were part of an act. He ordered a whiskey with a flourish, his eyes scanning the room for any willing participant in his new adventure. It was in that moment, surrounded by the stares of skeptical townsfolk, that Thomas began his transformation in Dunmore. The man who arrived with no clear purpose soon became the center of attention. People, unsure of what to make of him, were pulled into his orbit. Some of them found his antics amusing, others merely tolerable, but all were left with the same question. Who was this man, and what was he really running from? The first night Thomas spent in Dunmore was marked not by a soft entrance but by a loud, almost thunderous one. He had become the center of the town's attention, and it seemed as though he couldn't walk 2 steps without drawing a crowd. Yet, amid the cheers and laughter, a part of him still lingered in the shadows, alone with thoughts he didn't care to share. As the weeks unfolded, Thomas O'Brien's presence in Dunmore became more than just a source of entertainment. It began to alter the rhythm of the town itself. His boisterous energy was like a storm that swept through the quiet streets, leaving a trail of curiosity and fascination in its wake. But beneath the surface of his outgoing persona, something darker brewed, and it was this duality that made Thomas both magnetic and unsettling. One of the most dramatic moments in Thomas's time in Dunmore came when he took it upon himself to revive the long-forgotten local theatre. The Dunmore Playhouse, a small building near the town square, had been closed for years, its dusty curtains hanging lifelessly, its stage untouched. The theatre, once a thriving center of community activity, had been shut down when the population dwindled and the younger generation moved to bigger cities. But Thomas, ever the optimist, couldn't stand the thought of such a place being abandoned. It started as a joke one evening in the tavern. He had spent the night exchanging stories with a few locals when the topic of the old theatre came up. One of the regulars, John, mentioned how the place had been falling apart for as long as he could remember.
You could probably get a good show out of it, but I doubt anyone would come,
John said, sipping his beer. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with mischief.
Oh, I bet we could get people in there. In fact, I could probably put on a show myself.
The group laughed, assuming it was just another one of his exaggerated boasts. But the next morning Thomas set to work. He marched down to the playhouse with a determined swagger, hired a local carpenter to repair the roof, and brought in painters to brighten up the faded walls. He went door to door, personally inviting people to a grand opening for the following Friday night. The people of Dunmore were skeptical. They had heard grand promises before, but no one truly believed that an eccentric newcomer could pull off a show. However, as the days went by, the townspeople began to gossip. There was something undeniably magnetic about Thomas's enthusiasm, something that made it impossible to dismiss him entirely. The playhouse, once an afterthought, was now buzzing with the excitement of what could be. The night of the show arrived, and the small town gathered, unsure of what to expect. The playhouse, with its freshly painted exterior and repaired windows, now looked like a place that had a chance to shine again. People trickled in, taking their seats in the cramped wooden chairs. The atmosphere was electric, and there was a strange tension in the air, half excitement, half doubt. When the lights dimmed, the room fell silent. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Thomas strode onto the stage, wearing an elaborate costume that looked more suited to a Broadway production than the worn-down theatre in Dunmore. His presence was commanding, and the crowd, despite their uncertainty, was drawn to him immediately. With dramatic flair, Thomas began his one-man performance, a mixture of absurd humor, exaggerated gestures, and outlandish stories that had no clear plot. At times he broke character, laughing at his own absurdities, but that only made him more endearing. The audience, at first hesitant, soon found themselves laughing along, caught up in the energy he exuded. But the true drama came when Thomas, in the midst of his performance, began to weave in personal anecdotes. He spoke of his travels and the people he had met along the way. At one point he told a story about losing someone dear to him, a moment that caught the audience off guard. His voice cracked for just a second, and for the first time, the larger-than-life figure of Thomas O'Brien seemed vulnerable. The laughter died down, replaced by a collective breath held in the air. In that brief moment, the townspeople glimpsed the depth beneath his flamboyant exterior. It was a glimpse of the man Thomas had been running from, a man who had seen more pain than he let on. The performance continued, but the tone shifted. What began as a wild, boisterous show turned into something more raw and honest. Thomas's antics no longer seemed like mere distractions. They were pieces of his own search for meaning. When the final curtain fell, the audience stood in stunned silence before erupting into applause, not just for the performance, but for the raw emotion Thomas had shared with them. He had turned the theater into a mirror, reflecting both the joy and the sorrow of life. The people of Dunmore had come expecting a show, but they had left with a deeper understanding of the man who had brought them all together. After that night, something shifted in the town. Thomas became more than just a loud character with tall tales. He became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that life, no matter how small the town or how limited the resources, could still be filled with grand, unexpected moments. People started approaching him more regularly, sharing their own stories and ideas. The tavern, once the central gathering place, now saw frequent visits from townsfolk who had come to see Thomas, not just for his tales, but for the way he made them feel alive. But as much as Thomas had made an impact, his presence began to strain the boundaries he had carefully set for himself. With each new connection, each new person drawn into his orbit, he found himself confronting emotions he had long buried. One evening, after a particularly lively conversation with a group of townspeople at the tavern, he left abruptly. He was in high spirits, laughing as he exited the door, but there was an unmistakable air of unease around him. He walked the streets aimlessly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night, and found himself standing in front of the now empty theater. He stared up at the building, its lights now dimmed. For a fleeting moment, the grandness of what he had just done overwhelmed him. He had given the town something it hadn't known it needed. But there was a gnawing emptiness in his chest, a sense that no matter how many people cheered for him, the applause couldn't fill the hollow spaces inside. In the following days, the people of Dunmore began to notice the inconsistencies in Thomas's character. He would show up to the tavern with his usual energy, laughing and entertaining, but then disappear for hours, sometimes days, without explanation. The boisterous man who had once walked through the town like a whirlwind now seemed to retreat into himself at times, leaving only traces of his larger-than-life persona behind. Yet even as his shadows grew deeper, the town's fascination with Thomas only intensified. They saw him as both a spectacle and a mystery, someone whose outsized personality couldn't hide the cracks in his soul. Despite the flashes of vulnerability, he had become too ingrained in the fabric of Dunmore to ever truly fade away. And so, Thomas O'Brien's boisterous character continued to dominate the town's landscape, a man constantly on the verge of revealing something greater, but never quite doing so. His loud laughter, his extravagant gestures, and his spontaneous performances were now part of Dunmore's identity, and the people, whether they realized it or not, had become irrevocably drawn into his world. As the weeks bled into months, the boisterous, larger-than-life persona that Thomas had so carefully cultivated began to show signs of wear. Beneath the surface of his ever-present exuberance, cracks started to appear, and it was only a matter of time before the town began to notice. It was the first cold snap of winter when Thomas's transformation became undeniable. The townspeople had grown used to his dramatic entrances into the tavern, his booming voice that filled the space like a foghorn. But one evening, just as the sun was setting, Thomas walked in as he always did, but this time he was different. His shoulders slumped, His usually immaculate clothing was disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for his drink.
You all right, Tom?
Harold asked gently, leaning in close. For a moment there was no response. Thomas's gaze remained fixed on his drink, his eyes distant. Then, with a half-hearted chuckle, he finally looked up.
Yeah, just tired, that's all.
But there was something off in his tone. The words were forced, a hollow attempt to mask the deeper struggle. The rest of the tavern fell silent, sensing the vulnerability in the exchange. Harold tried to press further, but Thomas quickly changed the subject, his usual bravado returning, but with less vigor. He launched into one of his elaborate tales, about a street magician he'd once met in Prague, or so he claimed, but it was evident to everyone in the room that the charm had faded. The stories seemed more hollow than usual, and his laugh felt more like an empty echo than the joyful sound it once had been. That night, Thomas didn't return to his usual energetic self. He left the tavern early, walking out into the cold night air. The people inside could still hear his footsteps fading into the distance. For the first time in months, the town was left with a haunting silence, a silence that spoke louder than any of Thomas's stories ever had. In the days that followed, Thomas became more withdrawn. He stopped attending the tavern for a while, and when he did show up, his visits were sporadic, almost unpredictable. The townspeople, who had come to rely on his lively presence, now found themselves missing the man they had come to know. The absence was palpable, like a fog that refused to lift. But no one knew how to reach him. One afternoon, as the town was blanketed by a heavy snowfall, the most dramatic scene of all took place. A fire broke out in the old house Thomas had rented on the edge of town. The fire started just after dusk. Thick, black smoke billowed from the windows of the house, a sharp contrast to the peaceful, snow-covered landscape. It was an old, creaky structure, the kind of house that had seen better days. But for Thomas, it had been a symbol of starting over, a place to escape the ghosts of his past. The townspeople had seen him working tirelessly on it, painting the walls, fixing the windows, making it his sanctuary. It had been his project, his retreat, and now, in an instant, it was gone. The first to notice the smoke was Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly bookstore owner. She rushed to the window, pressing her face to the glass, her breath fogging up the surface. Her heart sank as she saw the flames climbing higher and higher, licking at the sky. Panic spread quickly through the town. People poured out of their homes, rushing toward the house with fire extinguishers and buckets of water, but it was clear that the fire was already too far gone. The fire department arrived, but by the time they set up their hoses, the damage had already been done. The house was a smoldering wreck, the flames reducing it to little more than a skeleton of blackened wood. The night air was thick with smoke, and the bright orange glow illuminated the faces of the gathered onlookers. They stood frozen, unsure what to do, what to think. No one could believe what was happening. Amid the chaos, someone spotted Thomas standing at the edge of the crowd. He was watching, his face illuminated by the glow of the flames, but his expression was unreadable. He didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders hunched against the cold. His gaze was distant, as if he were somewhere far away, lost in a world of his own. It wasn't until the fire had been fully contained that Thomas finally spoke. He muttered something to no one in particular, something about how he'd seen enough fires in his life. His voice was flat, emotionless. The townspeople who had gathered around him didn't know what to say. They had never seen him like this before. There was no grand gesture,